What is the best resistance to have in D&D? This is a question that I've wondered about for a very long time, and I finally have the answer. When I started making this monster data analysis series a few months ago, this was actually the first thing that we wanted to figure out. But my god, was it insanely time consuming to work through all this data and clean it up, which is why it's taken so long to release it. So if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, I'm like 1,000 subs away from 20,000. It would really mean a lot. Thank you so much. Anyway, resistances. It's really easy to figure out the inverse version of this, what the best damage type to deal is. You can even do it for yourself on D&D Beyond. Just filter by monster damage resistance and/or immunity and you're pretty much set. But at least as far as I've seen, there's no tool that goes the other way to figure out what the most common or hard-hitting damage type is. And after many months of work, we have it. Now, I will quickly go over the methodology and limitations here because I know it's not perfect, nothing ever is. So, we scraped every single monster stat block in just the 2024 Monster Manual. It would have been next to impossible to do anything more than that, so we just cut it there. The data we have here counts instances of damage from everything on a stat block, whether it's an aura from a trait, an on-death explosion, damage from any actions, bonus actions, reactions, legendary actions, and even from spells too. Any instances of incorporeal movement or other self-damaging effects were removed because they don't impact players. Now, one of the metrics you will see are occurrences of damage. If an attack deals 1d10 slashing plus 1d10 lightning damage, that will count as two separate instances of damage, one for the slashing and one for the lightning, even if they are coming from the same attack. Also, if something has like a triple multi-attack, we didn't increase the occurrences. It will still only be reflected once in the data. With that said, while we do have the exact details for each creature, what the attack is, damage saves, etc., everything here has been aggregated together, so the numbers that you're going to see are not on a per monster basis, but rather on a per attack basis. Damage from spells also assumes average damage from the full roll, so saving is not considered. Also, yes, I am aware that monsters are not often chosen at random. This is an obvious limitation. The purpose here was less about someone's individual campaign or table, and more about helping the community at large understand these large-scale evaluations and to assist the homebrew community to see where some gaps might exist. And you'll often hear creators on YouTube or people on Reddit say, oh, X resistance is really good or Y is totally not worth it. So I wanted to actually figure out the answer to that question. And obviously, no, this does not consider your homebrew creatures or the changes that people might make to the existing ones because that's impossible to account for. As always, I've broken it down by tier of play, the metrics for which are on screen now. The tiers of play come from the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the CRs that have been matched come from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and I've used the standard party of 4. It's not perfect, but it's consistent and gives something for us to work from. You'll notice I've also included a tier 5. These are monsters from CR 23 through 30, as they technically fall outside the scope of the table. With all that out of the way, let's take a look at our table for tier 1, which is CR 0 through CR 4, and characters level 1 to 4. The first thing you'll notice are that we included a metric for both occurrences of damage and average damage. Occurrences count every instance that a damage type appears in a stat block, and average damage is obviously a measure of the average amount of damage dealt by a particular damage type per hit. Since the answer to what is the best resistance could potentially be answered by what's the most common or what hits the hardest, we just decided to look at both. And we did actually use a weighted metric to combine them as well, which I'll go through at the end of each tier. First up, let's look at occurrences for tier 1. With this, we can see that the most common damage type by far is piercing, with 177 instances. It's not even close. Coming in second place is slashing, which appears 95 times, closely followed by bludgeoning, which appears 80 times. This, on the face of it, looks like it's really good for barbarians, since their rage gives them resistance to all 3 of the most common damage types in tier 1. Though it is worth noting that all 3 of these types hit on the weaker side of things. Sticking with barbarians though, wild heart barbarians gain resistance to all damage types except force, necrotic, psychic, and radiant, which essentially translates to having resistance to poison, fire, acid, cold, lightning, and thunder. This is a pretty good spread. Poison does appear quite a bit, though it doesn't tend to hit very hard. Fire and acid are kind of in the middle, but thunder and lightning, despite not appearing frequently, hit super hard when they do. On the spell side of things, there aren't a ton of ways to access resistances, especially if we are sticking to the 2024 Player's Handbook exclusively. Resistance is the obvious pick, and it covers all the damage types with the exception of psychic and force. As it turns out, not being resistant to force isn't such a big deal at this point during the game, since it's both not particularly common and also not particularly punishing yet. Missing out on psychic is kind of a bummer though. Protection from poison gives us resistance to poison. Warding bond gives resistance to all damage types, which is obviously very good, but kind of comes with the downside of splitting damage. Looking outside the 2024 PHB though, the big one is Absorb Elements, though it is worth noting that this only applies to Acid, Cold, Lightning, Fire, and Thunder. Rounding up the top 5 as far as frequency goes, we have Poison and Necrotic. Necrotic surprised me here, but I guess there's just more undead than I really realized. Beyond that though, the two biggest surprises to me in this tier were how high Radiant is on the list, and how low Cold is. I thought for sure Cold would have been much closer to where Fire is, and Radiant would have been solidly at the bottom. A big part of this shift seems to stem from the fact that, as we've talked about before, a lot of creatures like the Knight and the Priest Acolyte have had Radiant damage added to their weapon attacks, and some animals like the giant elk and eagle that used to be beasts are now celestials, and as such deal some amount of Radiant damage too. Now there is something of an interesting story here if we instead switch from looking at occurrences to looking at average damage output of the hits. With this perspective, the two damage types that were the least common, Thunder and Lightning, we can see actually hit the hardest on average, and honestly quite a bit above the rest of the pack. If we look at the damage sources, I thought it would have been the case that these creatures just have access to spells, but really it's not that. Only 2 creatures each have access to Lightning Bolt and Thunder Wave. It's more that the creatures that feature these damage types just tend to be a bit higher in the tier, with many being CR3 or CR4. It's also worth noting that there are a few dragons in this range, which is helping to increase the pain here. This is all part of why I think it's important to not strictly look at the numbers, but also help contextualize it in some way. Anyway, rounding out the top 5 here in tier 1, we have Acid, Psychic, and Fire. Honestly, all of these were a bit of a surprise to me, but especially Psychic. I had assumed it would have been a reasonably rare damage type, and especially so in tier 1. I know it is a lot more common in 2024, but I am surprised by just how much. Acid also for some reason just seems like a damage type that I almost never see, that I kind of forget that it exists, and yet it has quite a strong showing here in both occurrences and output. Overall, tier 1 is a very interesting place. Barbarians are definitely set up for the best as far as resistances go, especially if you look at the path of the Wildheart. The huge advantage that Barbarians have is that their resistance is passive. While yes, they do have to activate their rage, they will more often than not have it up during combat when it is most required. This is in contrast to casters who, if they want to cast something like Absorb Elements, they need to consume a spell slot. Resistance, fortunately, is a cantrip, but it's only available to Artificers, Clerics, and Druids, and does require concentration. In tier 1, I don't think there's any way to argue that resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage isn't the most valuable. Basically, everything is dealing it. It's too common and reasonably strong enough to not be highly ranked. Outside of those, it does get a bit tricky. There's a strong argument for Lightning or Thunder, since despite not hitting often, when they do hit, they hit freaking hard. But that said, it's also fairly easy to know if you're in a campaign where you're going to be facing a blue dragon or something. Using weighted values to combine the two metrics, we can see that Poison and Psychic round out the top 5. I should be clear that I'm not saying that the weighted value method is necessarily the best, it's just yet another way to look at it, which is why I'm providing all 3 of these options. I think it's just the easiest to pick if you were just going to cite one of them, so I'm going to do this for each tier. Moving on to tier 2, which is CRs 5 through 12 and characters level 5 through 10, here we do see some big changes, but also a lot more of the same. Piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning damage are still the 3 most common damage types, even in the same order that they were before. But 2 things are very much worth noting here. Firstly, the delta between piercing and everything else is nowhere near as drastic as it was before. The second thing is that the average damage of each of these 3 types is fairly low. Slashing is actually the lowest output for everything in tier 2. What this means for our barbarian friends is that rage is still doing a pretty good amount of work. While it's probably not as effective on a per hit basis since the average output from each hit is quite low, but because of how commonly it appears, as I said, it's definitely still doing the work. However, it's not all good news for our angry friends, since it's in tier 2 where we start to see a lot more mixed attacks coming into play, where an attack will deal say some amount of slashing damage, but then also an elemental type like poison. These are becoming much more common in this tier, which does make rage feel a bit less powerful than it was in tier 1. Wildhearts, they're still chilling though. Some other interesting movements here are Fire, which climbed up a spot and hits for more than double the average as compared to what it did in tier 1. That's a big deal. Cold is still kind of middling as far as frequency goes, but hits like a freaking truck when it does. Interestingly, Lightning is kind of in the same spot as it was in tier 1, not showing up frequently, but when it does, it's brutal. Notably though, Thunder has massively waned here, as it is both the second least common damage type, but also the second least potent, actually dealing less damage on average than it did in tier 1. It's at this point in class progression that some others outside of just barbarians are also starting to get access to some resistances. Admittedly though, a lot of them are coming right at the end. Circle of the Land Druids get Nature's Ward at level 10, which gives them a resistance that coincides with their land choice, so it could be fire, cold, lightning, or poison. I think any of these four are exceptional in this tier, even lightning, as despite not appearing often, it hits really hard as previously discussed. Circle of the Sea Druids get their Stormborn feature at level 10 as well, which provides resistance to all three of cold, lightning, and thunder. Thunder is certainly the least relevant in general at this stage, but will have some value overall. Also at level 10, Sire Warrior Fighters and Great Old One Warlocks also get resistance to psychic damage. This is a great grab in both tiers 1 and 2, as it does appear far more commonly and hits way harder than I had initially anticipated, which makes it even better for Aberrant Sorcerers who gain the resistance at level 6. At level 7, Oath of Ancients Paladins get their Aura of Warding, which grants them and anyone within their aura resistance to necrotic, psychic, and radiant damage, which is very good. The only downside is that it's quite limited to the tight 10-foot emanation. At level 6, Draconic Sorcerers get Elemental Affinity, which lets them choose from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poison to get a resistance to. At this stage, Fire or Poison feel like the no-brainer pick, though again this will vary from table to table, we're just speaking generally here. Celestial Patrons get resistance to radiant damage at level 6 with Radiant Soul, which is admittedly flavorful, but probably not the best pickup. Fiend Warlocks, on the other hand, at level 10 can choose any damage type other than Force to be resistant to, and can swap it during a short or long rest. This is amazing flexibility. Incidentally, Force, the one that you're locked out from picking, up until this point in the game, is probably one of the worst picks anyway, so it doesn't actually feel all that bad. As we can see, unlike in tier 1, gaining access to resistance is becoming a big part of a character's progression during this point of the game. On the spell side of things, it's still not looking that great though. Aura of Purity grants resistance to poison, which is definitely great at this stage. Fire Shield is nice, giving the flexibility of either cold or fire, and comes with the added benefit of not requiring concentration, which is huge. Protection from Energy lets you give one creature resistance to one of Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Thunder, but the problem is that this is almost certainly not worth your 3rd level spell slot. And Stone Skin gives someone resistance to all 3 of Bludgeoning, Piercing, and Slashing damage, which, as we have seen, is very good, but is going to get pretty damn expensive given that it consumes its component, requires concentration, and is a 4th level spell slot. It's just a lot to ask. I guess you could use Hallow if you had a full day to prepare though. Looking at it from the perspective of damage output, our top 5 are Lightning, Cold, Acid, Psychic, and Fire. Again, balancing for both metrics and using weighted values, we can see that Fire and Psychic damage make up the rest of the top 5. Now, this is only telling us part of the story, as it looks exclusively at tier 2 and ignores everything that happened before in tier 1. So I also wanted to calculate the rolling weighted values of our resistances as we progress through play. So here, if we include tiers 1 and 2, we can see that our top resistances are Piercing, Slashing, Bludgeoning, Fire, and Poison. Moving on to tier 3, which is CRs 13 through 20 and characters level 11 to 16, we see some major swings for the first time. Bludgeoning, Piercing, and Slashing are no longer the top of the board as far as frequency goes, though Slashing is still barely hanging on. But now, for the first time, our 2 most common damage types are Elemental in the form of Necrotic and Fire, with Slashing, Psychic, and Piercing rounding out the rest of the top 5. The big thing is that not only are Necrotic and Fire very common, they both hit pretty damn hard, particularly Fire. A big part of the reason for this is that we have the adult versions of the Brass, Gold, and Red dragons here, which are definitely putting in some work, but it is more than just them. We've got the Baylor, Death Knight, Githyanki Dracomancer, Iron Golems, and even more to add up, making fire damage pretty lethal in this range. Psychic damage is still holding a strong top spot for frequency, though its power is definitely waned in this tier, as it's only marginally higher than it was in tier 2, and among the lowest overall in tier 3. This is the first time in our progression that we begin to see the power and overall relevance of Barbarian's Rage dwindle a little bit. Damage from Bludgeoning, Piercing, and Slashing damage is not extremely common in this range, and more important, the average output from these 3 types are actually the lowest in all of tier 3. The case for Wildheart Barbarians is interesting too. As a reminder, they get Cold, Fire, Acid, Lightning, Poison, and Thunder resistance, notably not being able to pick Necrotic. Fire and Cold are definitely great in this tier, but it's a bit more complicated for Poison, Acid, Thunder, and Lightning. As, aside from Radiant, which barely has any representation here, those 4 damage types are the least common. Though, when they do hit, it's the equivalent of face tanking a truck. Now, the big reason for this does actually come down to dragons once again, as tier 3 is home to the adult variants of the Black, Blue, Bronze, Copper, and Green dragons, which comprises the majority of instances of these damage types that they occur. Though they aren't alone, again, as the Baylor, Purple Worm, Storm Giant, and a few others are also still in play. All of that is not to say that barbarians are losing the power of their resistances though, as the Path of the Zealot Barbarian at level 14, they get their Rage of the Gods feature, which does provide resistance to necrotic, psychic, and radiant damage, which is excellent as in pretty much every tier of play, both psychic and necrotic have been quite relevant. Admittedly though, this only lasts for 1 minute per long rest, and as long as Rage is active, so it isn't quite as passive as it's been in the past. At level 14, Circle of the Stars Druid get their Full of Stars feature, which provides them with resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage while they are in their starry form. Now, incidentally, as we have discussed, this is the least relevant tier to gain this resistance, but obviously it's not like just because you're in tier 3 you'll never encounter creatures from lower tiers again, so it's not like it's completely irrelevant. I still think that this is a very good pickup. Hunter Rangers at level 15 get Superior Hunter's Defense, which lets them use their reaction to gain resistance to the damage type that they were just dealt until the end of the current turn. The flexibility is great here, which makes it useful, but obviously does come at the cost of your reaction. At level 14, Abjurer Wizards also gain resistance to all damage from spells, which is obviously very good, but still is at least somewhat limiting. The vast majority of damage output, both in terms of frequency and amounts, do not come from spells anymore. Many monsters have spell-like abilities that deal significant damage that the Abjurer's spell resistance simply would not cover, like a Mage's Arcane Bolt or the Death Knight's Hellfire Orb. That's not to say that monsters don't have damage-dealing spells. We've already seen plenty of Lightning Bolts, Thunder Waves, and Fireballs, but it is substantially less common than damage-dealing attacks. Looking at spells, there's not a whole lot here. Hero's Feast gives resistance to poison, and technically Windwalk gives resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, but that's not really a spell that's usable in combat, so it doesn't really apply. Tier 3 is interesting as it is the first time that we don't have all three of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing trio at the top. Again, using our weighted values, we can see that our top 5 are fire, necrotic, slashing, psychic, and lightning. That said, continuing with our rolling weighted values, we do see some shakeups happening here. Our top 5 are now piercing, slashing, fire, bludgeoning, and necrotic. As we move into tiers 4 and 5, we can see that the available data that we have to pull from is getting quite small. There really just aren't all that many creatures in this range, but we're still going to do our best. So looking at tier 4, these are creatures from CR 20 through 22 and characters leveled 17 through 20. Looking at frequency, slashing appears the most common, but it's really not by all that much. What is interesting is that this is the first time that we really see force damage making a strong showing for itself, being tied for second place at least as far as frequency goes, albeit despite having a relatively low output. The other thing that's crazy to see here is that piercing, our undisputed GOAT in tier 1, is now chilling all the way at the bottom, only showing up twice, with bludgeoning not doing all that much better, showing up only 3 times. Flipping it around to look at average output, we can see that lightning, acid, poison, fire are all putting in some serious hurt at averaging over 30 damage per hit, which is quite significant. A large amount of these types of damage are coming from our ancient dragon friends, which are entering the mix in tier 4 though. But again, they are also not alone, as we do have the Artag, the Elemental Cataclysm, Lich, and Pit Fiends also hanging out here. What's interesting is that this is where the random sampling becomes less relevant. Just due to the small quantity of creatures, obviously not counting for any homebrew, there is a very high probability that an adventuring party in tier 4 will probably be fighting an ancient dragon of some sort, so there is that. In this range, we are still acquiring some resistance too, which is very cool to see. War Domain Clerics gain resistance to all of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, which is such a consistent damage type that even though it's not as prevalent here, it's still very nice to have. At level 17, Warrior of the Elements monks get resistance to one of acid, cold, fire, lightning, or poison, while their elemental attunement is active and can switch it at the start of each of their turns. This offers great flexibility as some encounters may have a smattering of different damage types to deal with. Also at level 18, monks again get their superior defense feature, which allows them for the cost of 3 focus points to gain resistance to all damage types except force for a full minute. This is obviously very good to have, but does make elemental monks feel at least a little bit bad. Obviously, elemental epitome doesn't cost any focus points, so that is the plus there, but it's only one type at a time, whereas this is all except force. Since we're also in tier 4, we can also gain access to an epic boon. There are currently 2 that offer resistances, the Boon of Energy Resistance and the Boon of the Night Spirit. The Boon of Energy Resistance allows us to choose 2 from Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, Necrotic, Poison, Radiant, or Thunder. Just to be clear, this essentially just leaves out bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, and force damage. And then there is the Boon of the Night Spirit, which as long as you're in dim light or darkness, you gain resistance to all damage types except Psychic and Radiant. Using the weighted values method, we can see that our most valuable resistances at this point are Lightning, Acid, Slashing, Poison, and Fire. But if we continue along using our rolling weighted values to consider everything from tier 1 through tier 4, we can see that essentially nothing has changed on our top end. Obviously, it's clear here that the sheer frequency of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage at the beginning is heavily skewing the results, but that still does speak to their overall relevancy too, so it's not completely without value. We do see a lot more shifting in the middle sections though, with Poison, Psychic, Lightning, and Cold all moving around. Finally, moving into tier 5, there isn't really a whole lot to say. Probably the most noteworthy things here are the fact that Force is the most common damage type, and Poison and Psychic don't appear at all. Lightning and Thunder still maintain their consistency of not really hitting all that often, but when they do, they obliterate. This time both averaging over 40 damage per hit, which is pretty crazy. If we're using our weighted value method, the best resistances here are Fire, Force, Radiant, Lightning, and Cold. And looking at our rolling values, absolutely nothing has changed since tier 4, since there just aren't enough damage dealers in this range to really move the needle. I think to no one's surprise, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing resistance is going to be extremely valuable in basically any game, which puts barbarians in a very good spot straight from the get-go, but also other classes which do eventually gain the same resistance. But certainly the Path of the Wildheart, Circle of the Sea, and Circle of the Stars Druid are probably in the generally best overall spot as far as resistances go. One other element of character creation to obtain resistance that I haven't touched on yet is your character species. Aasimars get resistance to both Necrotic and Radiant. Necrotic is the real winner here in general terms. Radiant has some points where it pops a bit, but overall, Necrotic is going to be much more valuable on average. Dragonborn get a resistance based on which draconic ancestry they choose, and it could be Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, or Poison. Strictly from a general value perspective, Fire and Poison are the best picks, so Brass, Gold, Green, or Red are the winners there. Dwarves gain resistance to poison damage, and there's not really a whole lot to say there. Poison resistance is generally pretty good across all tiers of play. And finally, Tieflings, who can get resistance to any of poison, necrotic, or fire damage depending on which fiendish legacy they choose. All of these are actually great. Technically speaking, fire is the best across all tiers using our weighted values approach, but honestly, you can't really go wrong here. So with all that said, if you wanted a simple answer to what is the best resistance to have, obviously, it's going to be bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. But I do also think that for the purposes of the discussion, it could be useful to ignore them. Everyone knows how common they are, so it's not really particularly interesting. So if we look over the entire progression scale, ignoring those three, it looks like Fire, Necrotic, Poison, Psychic, and Lightning are the top 5, with Force, Radiant, and Thunder trailing all the way at the bottom. This was a ton of fun. I know there was a lot of data to get through, but I hope you found it at least somewhat useful and interesting. Let me know your thoughts on it and if things landed where you expected. Check out some of my other videos, but otherwise, take care.